Okay, so this is a tutorial for doing a background for our finished and inked drawing, contour drawing of our animal or whatever you drew. First thing you need to know, this is my finished drawing. You can see the pencil lines that I've erased sort of maybe in the video. I am not going to be working with this. I'm going to put this aside, give it to Ms. Brand. She'll put it in a folder, keep it safe in case you need to make another photocopy. This is a photocopy, and so you all have at least 2 of these. So if you mess up, not a big deal, you can try again. That said, the things that I'm going to need on hand include paper towels. These are your erasers when you're working with watercolor. I've already ripped off a few little pieces because time is of the essence when you make a mistake with watercolor, so I have those ready to sop up the color. I also do need some that are a little bit bigger, maybe for texture, so I've got some more over here. I've got my brushes. I've got a light pencil, so your HB. I'm just using a number 2, same thing. HB, lightest. I've got my watercolors over here. I've got my water. I've got all my brushes. I'm going to especially be working with my very biggest brush, so make sure you have that one handy, as well as your smaller brushes for details like getting around edges. I also have this cardboard. So when this paper gets wet, it's going to stick to the table. I recommend that when you start to watercolor, you put this underneath it, and then you're just going to use this to transfer it to the drying rack. That said, before I watercolor, I'm going to start by going over my drawing with clear oil pastel. This is not in the kit that I gave you. It does not come with the standard kit. It's a blender, and it's clear, and we're going to use it to protect our drawing from the watercolor. So if you make a mistake, or if the water, sometimes it just sort of seeps over the edges, so we want to keep the color away from this guy. So I'm going to very carefully, using the edge of this, go over the edge of my guy first, not outside him, just along that line and inside that line. And it's better, I would say, well, I'm not trying to get it over the line. If you don't get it on the line itself, that's actually fine. We want it just inside the line. And then in addition to getting around the edge, I'm also going to be filling him in. It's basically clear, but you can see very lightly when you're in person that there's this very, very light yellowish tinge to this. So I'm just going all around this. If you want to kind of use a knife to shave this down and give your oil pastel a point, you can do that. Otherwise, I'm just kind of using the edge of it and just being very careful. So this is going to resist the water. Anywhere the water goes, that's where the color is going to go. So that is the primary thing that you need to remember with watercolor wash. Some other big picture tips that you need to know is that you're going to have to work pretty fast with watercolor because as it dries, the color kind of freezes. So if you have a hard edge on there, it's going to freeze that way. And you don't want a lot of hard edges. You want things to blend together, except for between 2 areas of color. So you need to keep adding water and kind of use that water to let the color blend out naturally, create gradations of color. So you will see that as we go. All right, so I'm going to pause the video and finish this off camera so you don't have to sit through that. Okay, so in between, off camera, I finished up going over this whole drawing of the lizard with the oil pastel. So now when I add my watercolor, it won't seep into him. First thing that I did before the video even started, I found some images to give me a sense of what I might want this background to look at, and then I've also got my actual little guy here. The first thing that you need to do, and that I want everyone to learn about, is creating a sense of the ground. And notice that the ground is always going to be behind the actual figure, All right, so it's not going to be a situation where you have a ground line and the thing is sitting right on top of it and the ground is like right here. It's always behind that figure. So it might be lower, it might be higher. That's just going to vary depending on the angle and the situation. So I'm going to add first a foreground line. If this guy didn't have a tail, I could put it as low as down here. But he actually sits with his tail sitting right on the ground. So the ground line has to be above the thing that is sitting. So I'm going to put that here, and I can put it sloping, kind of like one of these rocks that this guy is sitting on. And I'm drawing very lightly. I realize, you know what, you guys can't even see that, so I'm just going to make that a little bit darker just for you guys to see it. But you would not go over it. You would not make it darker in your own drawing. I'm only doing this so you guys can see it in the video. All right, I'm now going to create a middle ground. So I could use some of these for inspiration if I want, but don't try to do anything really complicated. So I might just keep my middle ground just something like this. And then I can also add a background. So in these, we're not seeing all the way to the horizon just because there are things closer to us. But if you wanted to look at something where you would see the horizon, you could. You might see trees, you might see mountains, just depending. So if you want to get a photograph where you would see that more, you can. Don't try to draw every tree. We're just drawing kind of a line there. And if I want it to look kind of like it might be a tree line, you can make it a little bit uneven. So a little bit bumpy, if you will. But not lots of big sort of puffy lollipop tree bumps, just kind of small little wiggle. So I highly recommend looking at something if you want to do something like that. Even mountains. Don't draw cartoon mountains if you want mountains. Make those a little bit more realistic with the shapes if you can. So looking is the way to do that. All right, so I've got my three separate lines. You could even maybe have two, but three is sort of our foreground, middle ground, background, and then sky configuration. All right, so now I'm going to mix up a color to be my foreground. I'm going to go with a green. And here's a trick that if you want your colors to be really bright, if you add a little bit of water to each of these before you get going, any of the colors that you use, they'll already be sort of activated because the water needs to seep in a little bit for the paint to get really bright. You could do this with a spray bottle if you have a spray bottle on hand. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mix. I want you to always mix your colors, so I could mix my own green using yellow and blue, and I'll get something a little bit different maybe than the one they gave me. But even more importantly, especially if you want this to look realistic, add a little bit of the complementary, so red. And that's going to give me this toned down, more realistic green. I'm going to have a couple of different greens here just to give this a little bit more realism. This one I'm making a really sort of yellow green, and I could make some more options there. And we can also continue to mix our colors right here, right on here on the page. All right, now I am just cleaning my brush. I want clear water. I can actually go right over top of my guy and save myself some time. Since he's got oil pastel on him, it should resist my water, so that was part of the reason we spent the time doing that. It means we can be speedy now. And like I said, time is of the essence with watercolor. If I go too slow, then things start to kind of go awry. So I have to keep my water wet and or go quickly. All right, now maybe I want a little bit more of a detailed brush because the edges are where you really want to be precise. So here's my edge. All right, so I'm going to basically add my green, and notice I'm sort of dabbing. You don't want to see brush strokes. If I want this to get a little bit more potent, I can dip into this and it's all sort of melty now, so I can get these colors to be a little stronger now that they're wet. So make this nice and dark. See how the color spreads around? You may find that as you go, it's starting to dry a little bit, so add a little bit of water and spread that around as needed. Oops. I can tell that I went a little too fast in some areas and went over top, went outside the lines. So I'm going to maybe go back and try to fix that. Notice this is getting a little on top of the oil pastel, so I can just mop that up. If you work fast, it's all about speed. All right, now I can also mix right on here as well. So you don't want to only mix on the paper, but you can mix on the paper. And I'm going to go to using my big brush now, and notice how I put a little more water on that to make that move around. All right, so I can put in big areas of color. If I want this to be a little more green, I could add green right in there. I could even add maybe a little red right in there, see what happens, so you can play with this. But don't get too playful until you have kind of covered this area. So I'm using the edge of my brush here to get that fairly smooth line. If you go over your original line, it's not a big deal if you go over it a little bit. That was just a basic guideline. All right, so I'm continuing to mix color on here and add it. Oh no, it's too red. I put too much red in my green. All right, not a big deal. I'm going to spread it around, and then I could add more green on top of that. Or if I really didn't like it, I could grab my paper towel and I could clean that up. All right, so before I move on, I'm going to make sure I've got plenty of contrast. So if this is nice and wet and I'm working with a big brush, I don't have to add any water. All right, and I can sort of spread this color around if it's pooling in certain areas. If you want to work with a small brush, if you kind of had this happen to you, I might even be able to put some of the color on top of the oil pastel if you get that thick enough. Or we can come back later and we can clean that up after it dries. All right, if you want to do a little bit with the texture on here, you can work wet on wet, by the way, on here. So if I wanted to, you know, kind of have areas where things are going on. And this is also just adding to the contrast here as I go. But I don't want it to be too Crayola-y. So just make sure that you continue to add some of those complementary mixed greens, maybe some of those yellow greens as well. So you want this to be rich in color, not too pale, but you can definitely keep adding. So see here how I can kind of get these sort of bursts with the wet on wet. If I wanted to create texture on here, I can do that with my paper towel, adding texture. If I wanted this to look maybe like a grassy texture, if this is a little bit less wet, I could do little dots or what have you. Maybe that's more of like maybe a little bit more like a rocky texture down here. One thing I just noticed, I forgot what I told you to do earlier, which was put cardboard under this. So it's already starting to stick to my table. So I'm getting my cardboard now from where I had it next to me, and I'm going to slide that underneath as I'm working. All right, now next thing I'm going to do is one of these background areas. Now if this is still wet, which mine is, I recommend going to a different area. So I'm going to go to the sky area. I can mix my blue for my sky before I start, with a little bit of orange to get it a little bit less of just a super, super bright blue and a little more natural, because we can always add more bright blue. Then I am cleaning my brush, and then I am adding just water. So if you see a little color, it's just because my water is a little bit dirty, but it should be just water. To this top area. I have a few little flecks of color I've gotten on here. I'm not going to worry about them. I think they're actually going to add to my piece, but if you use some paper towel, you could sop those up. If you do it really fast, they'll disappear. If you do it a little later, they'll get lighter. All right, so now I'm all ready to add my blue, so I can start with that blue that I've mixed. Maybe I'll keep that at the top. Now, if I want this to look, I'm also adding some brighter blue as well. If I want this to look kind of like there's some clouds, I can kind of go with having some areas that might be left white. See how these are really irregular and kind of long? That's more realistic for clouds. All right. And I can also, this is a great place to use our paper towel. So I can take out some of that color and create some subtle cloud texture. And I'm also making it lighter. So if you want to create more contrast, I can make these mountains dark if I want to, and make it lighter near the bottom. All right, so there is my blue. Now that said, I would probably wait a little bit before going on to one of these next areas. So through the magic of screens, I could wait and come back to this later. I think what I'll do, just so I can do this video all at once, and so if you were really wanting to move on, I could sop up some of this color. And again, if this is lighter over here, then that means I can make my next part a little bit darker. Or I could do this down here. Chances are, if you're working on this, you're probably going to have some of this be dry by the time that you would be ready to move on. So this part down here might naturally be dry, and you wouldn't have to soak up the color. Also, if your colors do bleed and mix together, that can actually look really cool and unify your piece. All right, so let's say I'm going to think a little bit about what I want to do. Maybe I want kind of like a yellowish, grayish, so greenish. So I've got my sort of very yellowy green. Maybe I mix that with some purple. Maybe that's a little too dark. I could try one over here that's a little bit lighter. Okay, so now I've got some yellow to add for that next one. All right, so I'm going to, again, start with a cleanish brush. So mine's a little bit dirty from my color, from my painting, several paintings this morning. All right, now I had, so you can see that as these are touching, they do start to mix together. So that's why it may be best to just wait, but don't worry too much about them overlapping, or if they do mix, if it's just a little bit, it can actually add to the unity. Now, I don't want my color going up there into that bubble. Anywhere where the water goes, the color will follow, so I'm going to get rid of that water before I add my paint. Okay. And then I can go ahead and start adding my paint. So I've got some good contrast, value contrast between this darker green and this lighter yellow. But if I didn't, I might want to use my paper towel to create that value contrast. Around the animal, I might want to go a little darker, again, to create that contrast. All right. So, at this point, I could make a little more contrast down here if I want to. I want it to be kind of dark to light. So I can kind of go back in there, make that a little bit lighter. If I want to solidify that edge a little bit more, I might be able to do that if this is dried next to it enough. It might be too soon, but I could come back and make this a little darker. But if I am making this darker, then I need to not just have this hard line here underneath. I would have to also add water down here for this to kind of blend. So you're kind of repainting to some degree that whole area if you need to make that top part darker. I can use little dots though to kind of blend a little bit as well if I want to. All right, so as you can see, this is still pretty wet. So rather than continuing now, I would just let this dry for a little bit, and I would come back to this next part, next class period. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure to have a whole week to work on these backgrounds. It's not really that they take so long in and of themselves, but you want to have a little bit of dry time to make life a little bit easier for yourself. Since I need to let this dry anyway, I'm just adding a little bit of texture into some of these areas where I had used the paper towel to get rid of some color. I could make this top of this a little bit darker. So having this little bit of contrast at the edges, that can help really make your piece feel more complete. So since I have to wait anyway, I can take my time now just kind of working on some of these details with this. So using almost, not almost, but yeah, similar to stippling, or we often call this pointillism if you're working in color, so using these little dots. But essentially it's really stippling. Pointillism technically is a particular type of painting style that does use dots. This isn't necessarily quite pointillism. And we can use some of that wet on wet, and again, just trying to create that contrast at the edge. So all of these different sort of greens and browns and grayish colors, all using the complementaries, these are going to make this look way more realistic. Okay. So I'm just trying to have a little bit of unity with spreading these around. And the fact that I have some of these similar colors here and here, that also creates some more unity in this piece. So if you're just, kind of waiting for things to dry, this is a great time to add more texture. That said, I do notice some areas where, despite the oil pastel, this got a little bit of color on it. So I'm reactivating that with water because I noticed that it was starting to dry a little bit before I noticed it. So I can dab that up. You might be able to get a little bit into these edges, even despite that oil pastel, or we'll fix that up later. Seeing a few more areas where I can add a little bit more color up here, so we'll do that as well. So, and again, see all of these areas where the water is sort of making its own texture, these just make the piece more beautiful. And if I get a little bit of green in here, that's actually just going to add to the unity as well. I'm going to add some of this same dark blue over here, again for unity. So, and I'm just dabbing little dots. That's another way to blend if I don't want to go over this whole thing with water and do another wash. All right, so I waited and actually helped this dry a little bit with a hair dryer. For this last one, I think I'm going to go with this brownish color that I've already mixed up, and I could, change that a little bit as well with some more mixing. I'm going to start, just like I have before, with my clear layer. So if these overlap one another a little bit, once they're dry, it won't really matter. You might see it a little bit, but it often looks better to let them overlap a little bit than having white gaps. So since this space is a little smaller, I'm using my slightly smaller brush. So I recommend that if you're doing this, you're just waiting between class periods for a couple of these, or you may just be working a little bit slower, enough so that you will have things naturally drying. Okay. And just like before, I'm just dabbing in my color. So I'm kind of starting at the top because I've got a darker color underneath this, and the bottom of my sky is kind of light. So I can add a little bit more water as well to make this bottom part get a little bit lighter, as well as then going back and using my paper towel. So I do want to move my color around fairly quickly. If I don't add that fairly quickly, then I'm going to have to add more water to kind of spread things out. So I'm kind of spreading that all around, and then I can go back and get that slightly darker edge that I want. So this is my, just more of that purple and yellow mix, but with more of the purple than the yellow. You can see that as I've mixed it multiple times, it may come out slightly different, so you can just then create a little bit of unity by adding more of that. I could even add some more yellow to this, and I am going to want to get this all the way down to here, so don't have this stop. Don't be afraid to let these touch. But if I then do want to create a little bit more contrast, then I can use my paper towel, or if I have a little bit of a mistake there, just use my paper towel. So I'm really enjoying the way that all of this like water is mixing in here, so I can do that even more to create that. But again, I do want to use maybe a little bit paper towel to create contrast, texture, and just have some interesting effects there. So a little more contrast here along this edge. I'm trying to make these edges look somewhat firm there. So just creating a gradation there with the value. Same thing here, a little bit of gradation. And I could keep playing with this really as much as I want, adding a little bit, just to create interest and that kind of thing. All right, once I do feel satisfied with how this is looking, and hopefully you added your name at the beginning, because now at this point I can't turn this over. Now this is ready to go to the drying rack. Hopefully it's already on your piece of cardboard, but if you forgot your piece of cardboard, go get that and bring it to your table rather than trying to carry your wet painting without something underneath to kind of hold that in place. Okay, final step to this. After everything has dried, if you have a little bit of cleaning up to do on the lizard or right around, if your oil pastel wasn't quite as precise as you wanted it to be, you can go back in with oil pastel and or colored pencils. So I might use the oil pastels, a little bit easier to blend. You might have a little bit of trouble though getting in that detailed area, So you might want to go back and forth or even overlap some of your pencil. So you can clean that up by getting in there in any gaps and then using your blending tool to blend that out. You can also go over any areas where maybe you got a little bit of leaking with the color. You could go over those with white. They're not going to necessarily entirely cover everything up, but just kind of dull that down a little bit if you had a few little areas where you got some watercolor on it and didn't sop that up in time. If you have some areas here that look a little bit like outlines, you don't want those to look like outlines. So you take your blending tool. I'm just creating one with a little piece of paper towel, folding it in half. And then once I get to the very last fold, I just fold a triangle to make it pointy. So then I can use those to blend this out a little bit more so that you don't get just kind of a hard outline there. You want to create a gradation. So just a little tip that you can use there. You can also, like I said, you can zhuzh that a little bit with your colored pencil as well. You may find as well that maybe using multiple colors, so maybe I want my dark green around this edge, but maybe I find that it doesn't blend quite as well as I want it to into the surrounding area. You could go from your dark green to, in my case, this light kind of army green, and I can overlap these and play with those until you get the blend that you want. So it's going to have to be something that's going to be close enough to what's in that background that you can get kind of that natural blend, and you might have to continue that out a little more. You can even use this clear blending tool as well. So this is actually exactly what this was invented for. When you have a background that has a color rather than white, you can use that. And you can get in there again with that colored pencil, or you can even use, if you want kind of this grayish, you can even use a little bit of your regular pencil in there to help you get that blend just the way you want it. So I would keep going with that into some of these other areas where I might be having the same problem. One thing too, that as you're doing this, if you get some oil pastel onto your animal and you don't want that there, you can actually erase oil pastel. So you might need to scrape a little bit first, but then you can also erase. Other things that I am looking at, I might want to, since I use this dark green over here, it might look better if I also then use a dark green over here as well. So just kind of, again, just creating that sense of unity until I'm satisfied with what I've got over here. And just to demonstrate what I mean by erasing some of this oil pastel, I'll use a piece of scrap paper. So rather than intentionally making a mistake on this that I don't necessarily need to have. So when you need to erase your oil pastel, if it's pretty thick, I recommend scraping it off with a toothpick or your nail or something like that first. And then taking an eraser that's dirty, because you're not going to want to use that on a clean surface then afterwards, because it'll have some stain on it. But a dirty eraser, and you can do a lot of erasing. So it won't all come out, but you'll be able to get it a lot lighter. And then again, potentially go over it with some white to really fade that out and dull that down. So you can erase oil pastel, you can erase even colored pencil. It's just not going to erase completely. But sometimes a little bit is a lot better than nothing, especially then covering it as well and doing some other tricks. That said, I think I have this pretty well cleaned up. I might continue to add a little bit more shading around this foot just to kind of make that feel more consistent. And if I am adding shading, after you get those edges, then you want your marks to be kind of horizontal to make that feel like it's sitting on the ground. So I continue to do just a little bit more touching up off camera, but just using those same materials, making sure to use gradations. So when I was using graphite pencil, you can use a little bit of your blending tool with that as well, just to kind of finish that up.